The conference hall was filled to capacity. Reporters lined the back walls, notepads ready. Policy advisors sat in tight clusters, whispering to each other. Environmental leaders occupied the front rows, waiting. Cameras were positioned at every angle. This was supposed to be a routine policy forum, a structured discussion about legislation, energy, and the future of climate regulation. Predictable, managed, controlled. But no one in that room anticipated what was about to happen. When Leonardo DiCaprio rose slowly from his seat and turned toward the senator at the podium, the entire room shifted. Not just in noise, in atmosphere. The kind of shift you feel before you understand it. Every camera in the building swung toward him. Reporters stopped typing, advisors stopped whispering, and the senator, confident just seconds before, visibly paused. What began as a policy discussion was about to become something else entirely. A confrontation that would be replayed, debated, and discussed around the world before the day was over. But to understand why that moment hit the way it did, why that room went so quiet, so fast, we need to go back to the beginning. Leonardo DiCaprio was not in that room by accident. He had not wandered in from a red carpet. He had not shown up for the cameras. He had spent decades earning his place at that table. Long before most people in the entertainment industry were willing to risk their public image on a political cause, DiCaprio had made climate change the defining mission of his life outside of film. He founded the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation in 1998, not as a vanity project, not as a publicity vehicle, but as a genuine funding engine for environmental research and conservation efforts around the world. He produced documentaries, he traveled to the most devastated corners of the planet to witness the damage firsthand. He sat with scientists, researchers, and indigenous communities whose ways of life were being erased by rising temperatures and disappearing ecosystems. He used his Oscar acceptance speech, one of the most watched moments in television history, not to thank his agent, but to look directly into the cameras of the entire world and say that climate change was real and that the time to act was running out. People in the entertainment industry noticed, people in the scientific community noticed, and people in Washington noticed too. When he walked into that forum, he walked in carrying 2 decades of credibility, built not on fame, but on consistent, documented, serious engagement with the issue on the table. But not everyone in that room saw it that way. One person in particular did not, and that person was already standing at the podium. The senator stepped up with the confidence of a man who had given this speech before, many times. He adjusted the microphone, he surveyed the room, he smiled slightly at the familiar faces in the crowd, the lobbyists, the industry representatives, the staffers who had heard his arguments and agreed with them. He began calmly. Economic growth, he said, was not the enemy of the environment. It was, in his view, the only realistic path towards solving environmental problems. His voice was measured, his posture was straight. This was his territory. Policy rooms, microphones, the formal architecture of political debate. He spoke about American businesses struggling under the weight of environmental regulation, about energy workers whose livelihoods, he argued, were being sacrificed for a political agenda. Then his tone shifted slightly. He said the word that made several people in the audience exchange glances. Alarmist. Environmental activists, he said, were spreading alarmist narratives designed not to inform the public, but to frighten it, to manufacture urgency where careful, measured policy deliberation was what the moment actually required. He paused for effect. And then he said something that drew the cameras away from him entirely. He suggested that Hollywood celebrities were using the climate issue not out of genuine concern, but for publicity, for relevance, for the attention that serious political causes could generate for people whose fame was otherwise built on fiction. The cameras found Leonardo DiCaprio's face immediately. He was still, completely still. His expression gave nothing away. For now. The senator continued speaking for nearly 20 minutes. He criticized renewable energy subsidies, calling them market distortions that rewarded inefficiency and punished established industries. He questioned the economic viability of green technology, arguing that the timeline being pushed by environmental advocates was based on optimism rather than engineering reality. And then he returned to the science itself. He said it carefully enough that it couldn't be quoted too cleanly, but the implication was clear. Climate policy, he suggested, was being driven more by ideology than by settled scientific consensus. Some people in the audience nodded. Others shifted in their seats. One environmental researcher near the front quietly closed her notebook and placed it on her lap, the gesture of someone who had heard enough and was now simply waiting. At the back of the room, a journalist leaned over to a colleague and whispered something. The colleague nodded without looking away from the stage. And in the middle of the room, still, completely still, Leonardo DiCaprio sat with his hands folded, watching the senator with an expression that had not changed since the celebrity comment. Patient, focused, waiting for the floor. The senator finished. Applause from certain sections of the room, polite silence from others. The moderator stepped to the microphone and announced that the floor was open for questions. A pause. 3 seconds. Maybe 4. Then Leonardo DiCaprio stood up. The room reacted before he said a single word. A visible ripple. Heads turning, chairs adjusting, cameras swinging, the collective intake of breath that happens when a room suddenly understands that the dynamics have shifted. The moderator hesitated for just a moment, surprised, then nodded toward him. DiCaprio straightened. He looked across the room at the senator, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, completely calm. The kind of calm that is more unsettling than anger, because it signals that the person speaking has nothing to prove and nothing to lose. What he said next changed the temperature of the entire room. He did not start with a statement. He started with a question. He asked the senator how he could dismiss the overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change, not the opinion of a handful of researchers, but the documented, published, peer-reviewed conclusion of thousands of scientists working across dozens of countries over multiple decades. His voice did not rise. He referenced international climate reports. He cited documented evidence of rising sea levels, accelerating wildfire seasons, and the increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events. He spoke like someone who had done the reading, not like someone who had been briefed, like someone who had actually read the studies, absorbed the data, and understood what it meant. Then he asked the question that made the room noticeably quieter. He looked directly at the senator and said, "If the science is wrong, which specific climate researchers are incorrect? Which studies? Which institutions? Which peer-reviewed publications?" The question hung in the air. Simple, direct, impossible to wave away with a talking point. Several reporters began writing immediately. The senator's expression remained composed, but something behind his eyes had shifted. He answered with the practiced confidence of a politician who had navigated difficult questions before. Climate science, he said, was still evolving. That was not a dismissal of science. It was an acknowledgement that scientific understanding developed over time and that policy decisions made too quickly based on incomplete models could cause serious and irreversible economic damage. He argued that a cautious approach was not denial, it was responsibility. And then he returned to DiCaprio directly. He said it with a measured smile that was clearly intended to land as a reasonable observation rather than an attack. He suggested that, respectfully, celebrities, however well-intentioned, were not public policy experts, that passion was not the same as expertise, and that the forum they were sitting in deserved the kind of rigorous analysis that went beyond what documentary films and foundation websites could provide. The murmur that moved through the audience was immediate, not loud, but present. The kind of murmur that tells you something just landed in a way the speaker did not entirely intend. Several people looked back toward DiCaprio. He was already nodding slightly. The nod of someone who had anticipated exactly this response and had already prepared for it. He did not raise his voice. He acknowledged the senator's point directly and then systematically dismantled it. He said he agreed completely. He was not a scientist, he had never claimed to be, and that distinction was exactly his point. Because what he was doing, what he had always been doing, was listening to the scientists. The thousands of researchers who had spent their career studying atmospheric chemistry, ocean temperatures, glacial retreat, and ecosystem collapse. The people who actually held the expertise the senator had just invoked as the appropriate standard. Those people, not Hollywood, not activists, not political advocates, had already reached a clear conclusion. The planet was warming. Human activity was the primary cause, and the window for meaningful intervention was closing faster than most public conversations acknowledged. He leaned forward slightly. His voice remained steady. He said that ignoring those warnings was not a neutral political choice. It was a decision with consequences that would fall not on the policymakers making the decision, but on the generations that came after them. Then he paused and asked the question that stopped the room. He looked at the senator and said, "If the cost of taking action is economic disruption, what exactly is the cost of doing nothing?" Silence. Not the silence of confusion, the silence of a room processing something it cannot immediately argue with. The whispers started at the edges and moved inward. Reporters typed rapidly, fingers moving without their eyes leaving the scene in front of them. Two environmental researchers sitting near the front exchanged a look, not of surprise, but of recognition. The look of people hearing an argument they had made themselves in smaller rooms for years, now being made on a larger stage. The moderator glanced between DiCaprio and the senator. The prepared structure of the forum, the scheduled segments, the planned transitions, the orderly progression from one agenda item to the next had effectively dissolved. Nobody in that room was thinking about the agenda anymore. At the press tables, a journalist quietly said something to a colleague without looking away from the exchange. This is the story. Not the speech, not the policy briefings, not the prepared statements that would be distributed in press packets at the end of the day. This. The senator straightened. He had been in difficult rooms before. He had faced hostile questions before. He understood that the way you responded in a moment like this, the composure you maintained, the steadiness you projected, mattered as much as the substance of what you said. He shifted his argument. He moved away from the science and toward the economy, territory he was more comfortable defending. Climate regulations, he argued, threatened thousands of jobs, real jobs, working people in energy-dependent industries who did not have the luxury of reorienting their livelihoods around the timeline that environmental advocates preferred. He said that technological innovation, not government regulation, had historically driven environmental progress, that clean energy development was already happening through market forces, that regulation often slowed the very innovation it claimed to encourage. His delivery was smoother now, more assured. For a moment, just a moment, the balance in the room shifted slightly back toward him. Some of the nods that had disappeared during DiCaprio's pushback returned on the industry side of the audience. It looked, briefly, like the senator had found his footing. But DiCaprio was already leaning forward again. He let the senator finish completely. He didn't interrupt, didn't signal impatience, didn't perform disagreement for the cameras. He simply waited. And when the floor was his again, he spoke quietly. He acknowledged the jobs argument, genuinely, specifically, without dismissing the real anxiety behind it. He said that economic transitions were difficult, that the people most affected by those transitions deserved support, investment, and real policy attention. And then he turned the argument around completely. He said that climate change was not a future economic threat, it was a present one, already occurring, already measurable in dollars. He cited flooding events that had displaced entire communities, droughts that had collapsed agricultural regions, wildfire seasons that had cost billions in suppression, reconstruction, and healthcare. Insurance markets in coastal regions already retreating because the actuarial math no longer worked. The economy, he said, was not being protected by inaction. It was being damaged by it, right now. And then he said the line that no one in that room would forget. He looked directly at the senator. His voice was quiet. Economies can recover from policy changes, but ecosystems don't recover from extinction. The room went completely silent. Even the whispering stopped. The senator did not respond immediately. His mouth opened slightly, the beginning of a response that did not come. For several seconds, in a room full of cameras and reporters and policymakers, nobody said anything at all. The clips were online before the forum had even officially closed. Someone had captured the exchange on a phone. Someone else had clipped it from the live stream. Within hours, multiple versions were circulating on every major platform simultaneously. The line hit differently on a screen than it had in the room. Ecosystems don't recover from extinction. 7 words, 12 syllables. And the image of the senator caught in that moment of visible stillness, that brief, involuntary pause playing on loop beneath it. The numbers climbed faster than most viral political moments, not because it was inflammatory, not because it was shocking in the way that outrage content is designed to be shocking, but because it was true in a way that was difficult to argue with. Environmental activists shared it with the energy of people who had been waiting for someone with a large enough platform to say exactly that. Critics pushed back, questioning DiCaprio's credentials, questioning whether celebrity activism hurt or helped serious policy discourse, questioning the forum itself. The debate in the comments sections mirrored the debate in the room, but the clip kept spreading. Within 24 hours, climate scientists were being asked to comment. Several did. A professor of atmospheric science at a major research university said that DiCaprio's framing of the scientific consensus was accurate, that the characterization of climate data as alarmist or ideologically driven was a misrepresentation of how scientific consensus actually worked. A marine biologist who had spent 2 decades studying coral reef collapse said that the extinction comment was not hyperbole, it was documentation. What struck many researchers most was not the content of what DiCaprio had said. Most of them had been saying the same things in academic papers and conference rooms for years. It was the audience. Millions of people who would never read a peer-reviewed climate study had watched a 7-second clip and encountered the core argument in a form they could feel. One researcher put it plainly in an interview afterward. The science has been there for decades. What was missing was a moment people couldn't look away from. The reactions from political figures came quickly. Some defended the senator's economic concerns as legitimate and necessary contributions to a complex policy conversation. They argued that the forum had been turned into a performance, that serious legislative work required more than powerful one-liners. Others argued that the exchange had exposed something that the formal architecture of policy debate often obscured, that the resistance to climate action was not primarily about scientific uncertainty or economic caution. It was about political will. Several lawmakers who had been largely silent on climate legislation made public statements in the days following the forum. Whether the exchange directly influenced those statements was impossible to say with certainty, but the timing was noted. The moment had become a reference point, something people pointed to when discussing the gap between what the science said and what the policy reflected. The confrontation between Leonardo DiCaprio and the senator lasted less than 15 minutes. In the context of a full-day policy forum, it was a small slice of time. But it was the only part of that day anyone was still talking about a week later. Because it wasn't really about DiCaprio, and it wasn't really about the senator. It was about a question that entire governments, entire industries, and entire generations were being forced to answer. How do you weigh the cost of change against the cost of doing nothing? How do you measure economic disruption against ecological collapse? How do you balance the visible short-term consequences of policy action against the invisible long-term consequences of inaction? These were not questions with simple answers. They were not questions that a 15-minute exchange in a Washington forum resolved. But they were questions that, thanks to 7 words delivered quietly in a silent room, millions more people were now asking. The economy can recover from policy changes. Ecosystems don't recover from extinction. Some moments matter not because they change minds instantly, but because they refuse to let people look away. That is the power of a moment like this. Not a press release, not a committee hearing, not a legislative briefing that reaches a few hundred specialists. A single exchange, a single line, a single second of silence in a room full of cameras. And suddenly, the conversation is everywhere. The question now is what happens next. Do moments like this translate into policy, into action, into the kind of structural change that the science says is necessary? Or do they fade into the news cycle, remembered for a week, and then replaced by the next confrontation, the next controversy, the next viral moment? That answer doesn't come from Hollywood. It doesn't come from Washington. It comes from the people watching. What do you think? Should public figures like DiCaprio use their platform to challenge political leaders directly? Or does celebrity activism do more harm than good to serious policy debates? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about the moments that shift public conversations, subscribe, because there are more of them coming.